And welcome to Meet the Press Reports, where each week we do a deep dive into a single subject. And today, it's millennial politics. What separates this group from other generations before it? Well, these young adults, aged 25 to 40, they've come of age watching the Twin Towers fall. Many of their neighbors go to war. Children hiding from shooters, practicing doing that as well. 2 recessions, and now a pandemic that has crushed the economy, just as their earning power should be growing. Born between 1981 and 1996, millennials are now the largest generation. They have officially overtaken the baby boomers. They're also the most diverse generation we've had yet. Just 55% in this country are non-Hispanic whites. Altogether, this new generation's appearance on the national stage will have huge implications for our politics, just like the baby boomers influenced it for so long. Millennials are the most educated generation in our nation's history, but they still find themselves with less wealth than the baby boomers. In fact, when boomers were 35, they had already held more than 20% of the country's wealth. Gen X and millennials are far behind them. And black millennials, they have it worst of all. Since the pandemic, their wealth now trails previous generations of black Americans by a whopping 52%. So the promise of American progress is something millennials have heard a lot about, but they haven't always experienced it personally. Each of the traumas that they've experienced have knocked them further away from the story they were told regarding American exceptionalism and the American dream. And in turn, they have lost confidence in institutions. There have been plenty of scandals that have lost trust in religious institutions, the military, law enforcement, political parties, the banking system, all of it, trust eroding. And it leads us to this fact. Millennials are without a political home. In fact, millennials are more likely to label themselves political independents than any other label compared to any other generation in our history. So it makes the fight to win them over one of enormous significance for both major political parties. So as their trust in institutions wane, will they eventually coalesce behind a single party? Or will they be the ones to simply transform our political system forever? My colleague, NBC News data reporter Dante Chinny, sat down with 11 millennials from all different backgrounds and parts of the country to hear what they had to say.
What do you all even think of the term millennial? And do you think you really are a generation? Do you think there's anything that makes your generation unique and different from other generations?
I think the term millennial is a very big basket. I'm on the end. I'm 25. I'm barely a millennial.
It's really hard to group us all into one term. And I think, like Calvin was saying, I'm on the other end, Calvin. and so I do see that. And so, I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, our views are all different. So I think that there's different areas within millennials that are very unique to each, almost like every, 3 to 5 years, I think you can almost group it into.
Us millennials, we tend to be more progressive, more forward thinking. We see things differently. We're sort of visionaries in a way. And the world ain't ready for us, so that's why they bubble us. They kind of fear us in a way.
How many of you are registered with the 2 major parties? I mean, literally registered, not just considered, but a registered Democrat or a registered Republican?
Sometimes I agree with what Republicans are talking about, and sometimes I agree with the other side. I think it would be helpful to have a third-party system.
I wish there was a 3-party system, really, but...
If there was a 3-party system, what would that third party look like to you? I mean, is there something you feel that's not being represented that you wish was in there?
I think the divisiveness it creates when you have 2 parties, you have to be one way or the other. So,
for any of you, did Donald Trump change the equation? He definitely was a disruptive force.
Donald Trump has made me even more liberal than I was before, but has also made me question a lot of the establishment.
Yeah, for me, I was pretty skeptical about his presidency, as probably a lot of people were. I grew up sort of Democratic family, and now I kind of land more right libertarian. And I think one thing that Donald Trump did was the fact that he's not a career politician. Sure, he's a businessman, but the idea was shaking up the establishment.
And even though Donald Trump lost, he reached a huge Hispanic population because he's not just talking about it the same way.
I think he polarized the parties. And so personally, I see a lot of people within my generation going to more of the opposite ends than in the middle.
The biggest problem is that everyone is more divided. It seems like politicians are more trying to rip each other apart.
What are the issues to motivate you?
It's almost appalling that there is no nationalized healthcare at this point. I remember whenever one of my family members, my little sister, she was born 4 months premature, our ambulance bill from a hospital in Seattle to a specialized hospital was $2 million.
Wow.
And we are beyond grateful that my parents had good insurance at the time, but I can't even imagine to think about someone who worked a minimum wage job or didn't have anywhere near as good circumstances as we did, that you just couldn't eat that bill. That would be the end of you financially.
I'm from El Paso, Texas. You've probably seen us on the news quite frequently. So immigration is a really big concern. I see personally what's happening, probably different than other communities, and it's sad. I think that the immigration is definitely something that needs to be handled.
So if I'm a politician, I'm trying to reach you guys in 2022. I'm trying to get you to vote for me. What do you want to hear from me?
Stop kind of pandering and assume like everyone in a specific like generation or race has like the same views.
Give realistic promises. I mean, you can't, there's a lot of things that you're not going to change. You're not going to change in 2 years. You're not going to change in 4. So
we're talking a little bit about social media, the impact of social media. Does it make it harder to have these conversations and talk about the stuff that politicians really need to be talking about?
On a good day, I might check out like a meme that a friend sent me maybe, but by and large, I think it's a really, I think it can be dangerous. I think there's a lot of disinformation.
Social media, the Facebook thing has like really stopped that face-to-face conversation where you can actually debate and like actually have good, productive conversation to where you're actually listening to the other person instead of just spewing out your own opinion and not listening to somebody else.
My generation is more about survival, and we use our resources and our education and our voice and even social media for that, to bring awareness, to make sure that we're heard, because that's the only way that we're taken seriously, when we come together and we use what we know to be heard.
How about trust in institutions? Caitlin, I think you mentioned like your trust in institutions waned. I mean, is that is something, again, that with millennials, we see an increasing drop in terms of pulling data over time, trust in institutions.
I wonder also if it's just, like as we age and lose our sort of, youthful naivete. So I wonder if that's just maybe not necessarily to millennials, but to just, the coming of age that we're experiencing.
We've gone through sort of these very unique situations with 9/11, tech bubble, real estate crash and market crash, and also COVID. And so that still has a ripple effect in terms of like jobs, housing, student debt. And it obviously affects a lot of families differently. And I think Caitlin mentioned it about as you're getting older, more responsibilities, you have to take care of family. I'm paying this much more in taxes. I'd start asking the question, well, where's my money going? What is it for? And realizing that it's not something a lot of it I agree with.
I think that one of the things that's happening with millennials is we're coming into age, like others have mentioned, and we're starting to own businesses. We're starting to employ people. And so I think that as we grow, we are worried more about and how we are going to pay the bottom line. And so I think that right now that's something that has affected our generation as they become wealthier and as they move up in the tax brackets. And, how are we being affected now personally?
Do you think the issues that motivate your generation, or you particularly, are different than what hits the body politic generally? My
grandma never worked a day in her life. My grandpa passed away long before her, and she was set. And I mean, you can't really, not many households can make it off one income anymore. Our
generation, we have unlimited resources, and that kind of attributes to what we bring to the table. Now we have a voice, and, we have the proper education. So they need to listen to us because we know what we deserve and what's best for us.
Well, joining me now is New York Times columnist Jane Coaston. She's host of the podcast The Argument. The man who coined the term millennial, Neil Howe. He's an author, consultant, and expert on generational change. I can tell you his book Generations is one that's had a lot of influence on my thinking. And actress and activist Alyssa Milano. who's used social media to energize millennials in everything from the Me Too movement to fighting Supreme Court Justice Kavanaugh's confirmation in 2018 to simply just getting out the vote in the Georgia Senate runoffs in 2020. Welcome to all three of you. And Alyssa Milano, I want to start with you because you and I are both members of Gen X. Neither one of us are millennials. And what's interesting is I'm curious, what have you learned about, you've had some success helping to activate millennials. What have you noticed the difference between millennials and our generation, Gen X?
Well, I think all young people have the same sort of wishes and goals. And I think the important thing is that we don't patronize them or use any generation as a tool. You know, we have to continue to earn their attention through actions and through showing up every single time. And I think that we have to stop treating them like a group to win over and start winning them over by fighting for policies that matter to them.
You know, Jane, Alyssa just referred to, I think it was one of the comments that one of the members of our focus group made, stop pandering to us. We do seem to be in this mode where, and I remember it as a kid when there was marketing to my parents, the baby boomers. It was this assumption that all boomers thought alike, all boomers voted alike, all boomers picked the same clothes, and we see the same sort of habits developing, whether in corporate or political America, when courting millennials. Obviously a mistake, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting, especially because millennials are often used as a cudgel against themselves. If millennials talk about it's really expensive to buy a house, we get these articles about like, oh, you should spend less money on avocado toast, not the economy is a little bit screwed up and you don't have the same purchasing power your parents did when they were 35. I'm 33. I was born in 1987. My older sister is 40. She was born in 1981. We're both part of this millennial generation. It's interesting how we still think of millennials as being young when if you're 25, you're on the low end of being a millennial. And it's an interesting conversation that we have grouped it in a cultural context as being young. But right now, the cultural unifier for us is having experienced so many continued hits to our economic and political power.
You know, Neil, I think that the thing, and you've studied this quite a bit, a generation first has an impact culturally, then has an impact politically. And it's sort of, that's the reason I want to focus here, because it feels like we're on the cusp of where the millennial generation is going to impact our politics going forward. What generation do they most compare to when looking back?
You know, here I am. I need to defend the concept of a generation. We sometimes tend to simplify it, right? I mean, generations, there are big generational contrasts when you look at overall sort of temperaments, attitudes, overall priorities. I mean, I listened to the focus group, and obviously we do a lot of surveys ourselves. And I can just tell you some of the things that I notice that are very different from what you would have noticed among boomers at that age or Gen Xers. And, you know, I'll just mention a few of them if you want, Chuck, and we can just, you know, talk about whether those fit or not. I notice a real effort to tone down the divisiveness and polarization. Be more polite, sociable, listen to each other. This is something that boomers were not into at the same age, I guarantee you. It was all about rage and defiance. You notice very little of that from millennials. Here's another point. They want to get practical, not in getting, you know, huge lofty ideals, but just simply getting basic institutions to work again. I notice that again and again. I mean, healthcare clearly is screwed up. I mean, anyone looking at it knows that it's not working, right? Cost, effectiveness. And rather than debate, you know, laissez-faire versus socialism, let's just talk about how to get that to work. Same way with higher ed, same way with immigration, environment, infrastructure, minimum wage. You can go down all these issues. Here's another thing, the community orientation. I notice people talking about not wanting to divide us up into little bits. And again, I think that is a generational attitude wanting to bring us together as a community. Let's get something to work for everyone.
And I think
Jane, let me build off on that.
Actually,
go ahead, Alyssa. Go ahead. You jump in, Alyssa. Sorry.
I think older generations actually had more, right? When you're looking at the things that millennials are fighting for and want, things like forgiving student debt, like racial justice, paying people, a living wage, the Equal Rights Amendment. I mean, these are all things that should be happening, right? And when you think about our parents' generation, not that I'm a millennial, but even my parents' generation, they had so many more social safety nets in place that weren't considered handouts. They were considered hand-ups. And I think when you're listening to younger generations saying things like, our institutions are broken, we have to pay attention to that. And we have to start attracting people to the issue rather than trying to divide by political party, because that's where we lose them. Because the younger generation are looking at our parents and saying, wow, my mom doesn't talk to her best friend anymore because, he was a Trump, and it tears them apart.
Yeah, no, there are unfortunately family reunions where I can't go on my wife's side of the family simply because of where I work and the way people want to talk on that. And I think this has happened to a lot of people politically. Jane, to build off another thing Neil said about, I think there's a stereotype of millennials that they want to be disruptors. But I think what it is, but they also don't want to get rid of institutions. They'd like to rebuild them if they don't work. Is that a fair observation?
Especially because I think what we're seeing is actually the culmination of actions that have been taking place over 40 to 50 years. I think about how, when I was in high school, I went to Catholic high school. That's when around the time that the church sex abuse scandal started to break out. But that wasn't an event that was taking place in the early 2000s. Those were events that took place in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. And we see this time and time again with events that we're learning about now. You're hearing about people talking about events that happened to them in the late 1980s, early 1990s. So it's not as if suddenly one day in 2005, we all just started turning around saying our institutions are broken. It's that these institutions have been failing a lot of people for a long time. And particularly as we have asked these institutions to do more than ever before. We think about our politics as being very polarized right now, but it's easy to not be polarized when you only include a very specific group of white men, when it's Southern Democrats and Northern Republicans all united around being basically the same group of people. And so I think that what we're seeing now is that we have institutions that are broken and that have failed, but then at some points, they were never really doing what they were supposed to be doing in the first place.
Alyssa, Jane, Neil, a lot more to say, but I'm short on time. Really appreciate this thoughtful discussion. After the break, you're going to meet the next generation of politicians. These are millennials that have already been in office for some time. And they're not just talking about change, they're trying now to implement it. Welcome back. Millennials may be the largest bloc of American voters, but right now they only represent a very small portion of elected leaders. NBC's Savannah Sellers traveled the country to meet with the young men and women who are building the foundation for what will be a major shift in American politics.
The world but I definitely believe that our generation is meant to be running for office.
Think these people look young? What about these four?
Well, they are young, but not too young to be the faces of the new political generation.
I still wear my ripped jeans and t-shirts every now and then.
Millennials have already started their ascent to just about every level of government across the country. Well before the 2020 election, millennial representatives started becoming household names as they harnessed the power of social media. Now, one of the first millennial White House contenders has become the first millennial cabinet member, and the nation's first senator born after 1980 has won a seat in Congress. There are even enough millennial reps on Capitol Hill, 31 of them, that they've formed their own caucus focused on the future.
Hi! Nice to meet you.
Representative Sarah Jacobs co-chairs it. Her predecessor, Susan Davis, finished out her last term at 76. Congresswoman Jacobs is 32.
Our generation has a very different perspective on things. We graduated college in the middle of the Great Recession. We're now experiencing the second huge economic crisis in our adult life. We were young when September 11th happened. We're shaped by all of these things. And I think that means we have a different perspective, and that perspective has really been missing. Millennials aren't waiting our turn. Don't think that there's someone else out there who's going to have the answer, and are stepping up and saying, no, we need to be part of this conversation because we've seen how it's failed before.
But of course, age across the spectrum comes with challenges.
Having to constantly be thinking about how I'm perceived by my colleagues, how I'm being seen as equal with my colleagues, it is a challenge, and it wears on you. I wish we could get an imposter syndrome vaccine. That would be great. So,
oh my God, it would.
Dr. Fauci, if you're listening.
And it will be in large part because of Philadelphia.
30-year-old Malcolm Kenyatta hasn't made it to the Hill yet, but he also knows about things really changing.
I'd come home one day and was sort of complaining about stuff on the block, and my mom was like, well, you know what? If you care so much, why don't you go do something about it? And I said, okay.
And how old are you?
I was 11.
He's now a Pennsylvania state representative, and he's been a rising star in the Democratic Party, working to get out the vote for President Biden in 2020, and even speaking at the party's virtual convention.
I heard you say once, a lot of the things that you would have thought would have disqualified you are actually the things that qualified you.
Yeah. A poor black gay kid from North Philly, like, I'll never win.
He now has his sights set on his state's open Senate seat next year.
The Senate has one millennial right now. He's new there as well. What do you think about that?
You know, first of all, I mean, how ridiculous is that statistic, right? 1 out of 100 when millennials now represent the largest voting bloc in the country. And we're 1 out of 100 of the senators. That is absurd. That is a huge lack of representation in a body that makes critical decisions. We have a cookie cutter view of who is the right candidate to run. The reality is the people who are experiencing the brokenness of government were often not asked to be in the room where solutions are being crafted.
Houston.
Yes.
It's like your kingdom.
I'm happy you're here and you guys are...
Down in Texas, Judge Lina Hidalgo thought her state needed a new type of politician too. In Texas, what most states refer to as a county mayor or county executive is called a county judge. She runs Harris County, the third largest in the country, and home to Houston.
How many people live in the county?
Around 5 million. More than most states, more than 26 states in population.
What's your budget?
$5 billion annually is the Harris County Commissioner's Court budget.
So you recently turned 30, right?
Actually, the day of my 30th birthday, I was at our emergency operations center because we were in the middle of the winter storm. We're just, you know, making sure that people had water and the power back on.
Since winning in 2018, she's made the role her own, focusing on issues most millennials seem to agree on.
Do you think that because of these crises, there's more possibility for reaching across the aisle here?
Climate change is one where the answer is yes. You're hard-pressed to find people who are scared to talk about it now. You know, we both lived through this moment. How do we live through it? And it's just a bond that's there. That's something that's going to help us work together.
No matter the age, it's a big job, and one that comes with critics.
What encapsulates what people thought and what people would tell me is, you know, oh, bless her heart.
Bless her heart
bless her
means
heart.
Something down here.
Totally. But there also were people who understood what I was trying to do. I was one of many who, after the election of Donald Trump, said, wait a minute, if he can do it, why can't I?
The man you unseated, he was a fairly popular, moderate Republican, Judge Emmett. 42, I think, is the math, years older than you?
Something like that.
I read that someone said, I didn't know that county judge was an entry-level job.
I needed to prove myself. So many disasters later, smart investments later, hopefully we're there. Hopefully I'm not done.
The 30-somethings you heard from, bright-eyed as they may be, aren't part of the youngest generation making their way into politics. The eldest of Gen Z can't even run for Congress just yet, but are already being voted into roles in state and local government. Like 22-year-old Iowa State Representative Carter Nordman. He's a Republican and in his senior year of college.
You've just become the youngest state legislator in Iowa. What's been the reaction?
I was a little nervous that I was going to kind of be pushed to the side and told, stay in your lane. You're 22. You don't have the experience that you need to have to make these decisions. One of my mentors told me that the legislature is very fluid when it comes to age. You're there just like everyone else there is. Voted on by your constituents to make decisions for them.
Carter, can I ask you, where are you doing this interview from?
So I still live at home until I'm out of college here.
Do you have an office that you could be doing this from?
At the state capitol, I only have my desk on the House floor. Hopefully someday that will change.
Look at you legislating from your parents' living room.
From parents' living room.
And at their young age, this next political generation is ready.
Folks hire all these young people for their campaigns, but then when the young person wants to run, they say, oh, no, hold on. Enough of that. Enough of that. We are qualified to do it. We are ready to do it. And we are best positioned to bring the energy and the passion that's necessary to get it done.
Savannah Sellers with a report that I look forward to looking at in 10 or 20 years. When we see how many of those folks we profiled are in even higher office. That's all we have for Meet the Press Reports this week. Thanks for being here. Up next, we're going to take a look at the history of activism in sports and how athletes use their voices for change more than they have in any other generation. And I'll see you next on Peacock and this Sunday on Meet the Press. Hey, thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.